All right. In the interest of time, we're going to get started. I'm still seeing people stream in. But I am Kate Bremen. I am the Director of Environment Maryland. We are so excited to have you here with us for our monthly conservation conversations. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Bridget and I started this series back in April of 2020. We had just found out that we were all going to be staying safer at home for the foreseeable future. And Bridget and I thought, okay, how do we continue to do advocacy and connect with people in this new world? And Conservation Conversations was born because what we really wanted was to have a space where people were still connecting, where people were able to learn from experts that maybe you never would have thought you could have heard from based on where you are in the country. And we really wanted to create an opportunity for people to engage with conservation issues in this very hopeful and beautiful way. So for those of us in advocacy, so often it's emails being like, act now, save the bees, help. And so what's been amazing about Conservation Conversations is it's created this space where we can just appreciate and we can kind of take on this perspective of learning and appreciating and celebrating the things that we're trying to protect. So thank you for coming on. Thank you for continuing to support us every month in this venture. I am now going to turn it over to Bridget to give some of the logistics on how this is going to work and to introduce our topic.
Thank you, Kate. So as Kate said, I'm Bridget Sanderson. I am the Director of Environment Missouri, based out of Kansas City, Missouri. Happy 2021, y'all. Thank you so much for, rolling into the next year with us with Conservation Conversations. I'm very much looking forward to our topic and our guest speakers this evening. We do love to have a dialogue, but we do, of course, save it for the end. So if you have any questions throughout, please, if you're on the Zoom webinar, put them in the chat function or the Q&A function. Kate and I are doing both of those. And then we are also streaming to Facebook Live. So if you have any questions in there, just put your questions in the comment section as well. So we are walking on the wild side tonight, and we will be talking about wildlife corridors. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex Peterson with Environment America.
Hey everyone, I'm Alex Peterson. I'm a conservation advocate with Environment America, based in Washington, DC. Really excited about our webinar tonight. So let me just give a quick 2-minute overview of the topic before our guests can really get into the details. So a 2019 United Nations report found 1 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction, many within decades. In North America, there are 3 billion fewer birds in the sky than in 1970. And actually in the United States, 1/3 of all mammal species are at risk of extinction. A big culprit behind this is the loss and fragmentation of habitat. And in the US, we continue to lose 2 football fields of nature per minute to development. Nature in this country has been fragmented into many pieces by roads, fences, and other development that blocks the movement of animals. And this can knock whole ecosystems out of balance and leave species more susceptible to other challenges like climate change and disease when they're sectioned off into small mating pools. One solution to this is to create wildlife corridors to reconnect separated habitats. So for example, this could mean buying and conserving land that connects 2 parks and opens up new habitat for Florida panthers. Or it could mean removing fencing that impedes the seasonal migration of elk and pronghorn in Wyoming. We can create these corridors through Congress. The Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act would create institutions to help develop a national plan, and it would dedicate $50 million a year in funding for these projects. So that's sort of the high-level overview, and now I'm really excited for our guests to get into more detail. So with that, let me introduce New Mexico State Senator Mimi Stewart, the lead sponsor of SB 228, the Wildlife Corridors Act.
All right, thank you so much, Alex. It's very fun to be here with Environment America. We have an Environment New Mexico. I've actually been nominated to be the President Pro Tem, and I'm about to hire the past director of Environment America for my chief of staff, so we can turn the entire office into environmental work. Let me tell you a little bit about our Wildlife Corridors Act, which we passed last year. So proud of it. Happened. So first of all, we have this student group in New Mexico called the Wild Friends. It's in our elementary, middle, and high school all over the state. We have 89 school districts. It's in about 25 of them. It's an after-school student group for students and children who care very much about wildlife. And there are thousands, millions, hundreds of thousands students who care about wildlife the same way we do. So they always, each year, their little groups all over the state decide what kind of bill or memorial that they want to sponsor in the legislature each year. So before I became a legislator, I was a public school teacher. So we kind of gravitated to each other, the Wild Friends and me as their sponsor, because I let them do all the work. So we present before legislative committees and they get to present their memorial. It's like a study bill or the bill. They get to answer the questions. It's a learning environment. Almost every year for the last 12 years, we have passed either a bill or a memorial. And 6 years ago, I believe it was, no, 8 years ago, losing track of time. We had our first Wild Friends Wildlife Corridor Memorial. And that memorial asked our Department of Transportation and our Game and Fish to work together to try to find a pilot for I-40 leaving Albuquerque because we had so many wildlife crashes. So we put up fencing and lighting. There's a culvert underneath the highway that wasn't designed to be a wildlife corridor, but we kind of made it into one. We used some cameras from Arizona. Arizona has the best outdoor wildlife cameras around. And so we took pictures of bear, deer, elk, cougars, coyotes. It was unbelievable how many animals used that. So the Wild Friends were all excited. I was excited. And then we decided that we need to go big and we needed to do this for the entire state of New Mexico. We are the 5th largest geographically in the country. Because we had asked the Department of Transportation and Game and Fish to work together on those Wild Friends memorials, they were already used to working together. So Michael Dax, who is the director of Defenders of Wildlife in New Mexico, and I spent about a year talking to people, Game and Fish, transportation, how to put together a state plan. And what we came up with is the Wildlife Corridors Act. It requires us in New Mexico to study and determine where these natural corridors are right now for big game. So we're talking about big animals, pronghorn elk, pronghorn antelope. We have a lot of those in New Mexico. Elk, deer, bear, cougar. I'm sure I'm forgetting some. Not really a hunter myself. So when they say big game, I want to protect those big game. So we did a study and we determined that New Mexico was losing we were having about 1,700 crashes a year on our highways. It was costing us about 20 million a year in healthcare, in vehicle loss. You know, you don't put a number on animal loss, but the animal loss was very high. So we started to do some work to try to convince the legislature that we needed this. They finally agreed. I had trouble with the ranchers. They don't want us to protect corridors going through their property. So we had to work with the Department of Transportation to ensure in the bill that we were going to bring in communities of interest and we were going to bring in the communities where we were looking to put in wildlife corridors. So We have 3 or 4 areas around the state that we've determined are the worst. And Department of Transportation and Game and Fish are now working on a plan. They have to do a prioritized wildlife corridors project list every year. They have to focus on our ability to reduce these wildlife vehicle collisions and to look at the community for support. We are focusing on areas where we need to do something about the traffic and the transportation anyway. Anywhere we are having building or construction with our highways, our roads, our overpasses, we are first sending the game and fish experts to determine what kind of wildlife corridor it is. I mean, Alex talked about the loss of habitat. The loss of habitat for our animals is just, it's incredible. And this plan that passed, we were supposed to get our first report this year, but then COVID happened. We also had a lot more money last year than we do this year. We had a $2 billion hit to our industries here. So we haven't yet received a new report, but it's essentially designed to have these 2 agencies really track animals in New Mexico and try to see where we put overpasses, where we put underpasses, where we redo where we were going to run the highway to begin with. We can use a lot of the culverts that you have to put under the highway. We can turn those into underpasses fairly easily. We're looking at high fencing and lights. We have one highway where most of the problems are, and that's Highway 550. It goes right through wilderness in New Mexico. Our wilderness doesn't look like other people's wilderness, rocks, chamisa, dirt, mesas, and antelope and elk and deer and bear and cougars. So New Mexico is part of the Rocky Mountain corridor. So, you know, cougars that start in New Mexico go up Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, into Canada. So we're really hoping that the governors associations will agree that we need to work across the boundaries. None of these animals know whether they're in New Mexico or Colorado. So really to get really good wildlife corridors, we need to work together as states. We looked at what Colorado was doing and Arizona was doing, tried to put some of their best practices in. But really when we can get out of this pandemic and we're talking to each other again, not about an insurrection, but about what to do about things we care about, wildlife corridors is right up on the top. It was our Senator Tom Udall that actually put in the congressional bill that Alex talked about. So that's real quick and a little history and what we're doing, and I'm happy to listen to others and then answer questions.
Very cool to hear about that. Thank you, Senator Stewart. So next up, we have Dr. Jody Hilty. She is the president and chief scientist of Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, which is a joint U.S.-Canada nonprofit organization. Their vision is to create an interconnected system of wildlands and water stretching all the way from Yellowstone to the Yukon. And she's a conservation biologist specializing in the ecological corridor and large landscape research, and has over 20 years experience managing large landscape conservation efforts. So with that, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Jody Hilty. Please take it away.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Senator Stewart. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today. Really neat. I'm going to talk about a little further up the Rocky Mountains for just a second here, about the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. Can you all see my screen now? Okay, excellent. So I come from the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, which I am the president of. And I just wanted to say, Senator Stewart, it's so wonderful to hear what you're thinking about and doing. We're about connecting and protecting the region from the Arctic Circle all the way down to Wyoming, and it looks like you've got that bottom half covered. We have 116 wildlife underpasses and overpasses already in the ecosystem, and we are working on both public land. So we've increased public land protections over 80%. A lot of those in the last 3 or 4 years have been Indigenous-led protected areas. And we worked with private landowners to ensure that wildlife can get safely across their lands. But today, what I'm going to talk to you about is the global guidelines for connectivity. And these are really important because so many entities are moving forward, like Senator Stewart talked about, but around the world, we have places like Kenya and Tanzania moving forward with corridors. Of course, the US is working on passing corridor legislation, and we all need to make sure that we're moving the right direction, because we do know that biodiversity is in decline. So I'm just going to give you a very high level overview of what's in this and what it means for us in the United States. The IUCN is the largest nonprofit conservation organization in the world. You might know it because of the Species Survival Commission and the red list of endangered species around the world that it keeps, but it has a lot of different commissions. I'm talking about the Connectivity Specialist Group and the work that it's been doing. So we've been working for about 2 decades to come up with the global guidelines for ecological corridors. It has been a long haul, many papers, many meetings around the world, getting scientists and policymakers to agree on principles takes a lot. Even just that we had 16 core authors, we had 150 individual reviews at one point. I had 137 pages of recommendations on a 50-page document. So how do you get global buy-in? That's part of the process. So what was the purpose of this? Well, one is just sort of consolidating the information, science information, on what we know about ecological corridors. Well, that's been done before, and that's important to have in the document. But the really new pieces are advancing really concrete guidelines, moving towards standards on what is an ecological corridor. And we'll get into that in more detail. And then the second is actually creating a world database on ecological corridors, because we don't know where, well, we know where all the protected areas are. We don't actually know where the conserved ecological corridors are. And this is sort of the missing link, if you will, get the pun. So in this document, obviously I'm not going to go through this, but we talk about, why is connectivity needed? It's needed because what's happening as human populations increase is they literally are bounding protected areas. We're just seeing seas of humanity around protected areas. And inadvertently, in places like my home state of Montana, people are moving in and developing corridors. And that means that wildlife can no longer move. And there's a big body of scientific literature that talks about the theories behind this and why corridors actually can help ensure that our protected areas protect species. Sometimes they're not large enough by themselves, but if you create corridors between them, then species have a better chance to survive, especially during climate change when species are moving through time and space. So on the graph here, what you can see we've had this huge increase in terrestrial protected areas over time. That's that green line, and that's really exciting and really important. And that's one of the elements that's important for connectivity. I think that marine terrestrial areas, which are the different blues, are really exciting too, because it's taken us a while to realize that the large, 2/3 of our planet need protection too. Unfortunately, though, when you look at connectivity between those protected other areas, whether it's terrestrial to marine or terrestrial to terrestrial, turns out that they're not very well connected anymore, right? That's because we're out there putting our homes and different developments all over the place. So of all of our protected areas, actually about only 9 to 11% are still connected if you look at sort of habitat. But that doesn't even mean that those places are protected. So we got to get to protecting those remaining places as a key component of conserving nature. But let's take a step back. In order for us to all agree on connectivity, we have to actually share a common language. And so I want to tell you this story about, the United Nations Convention for Migratory Species obviously cares about connectivity. That's a policy group. So I actually went to Germany a couple of times with a lot of our partners, and together we came up with this agreed upon definition in the upper left of ecological connectivity being the unimpeded movement of species and flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. And generally speaking, people can understand that, but the scientists didn't like that. So we had to actually then ensure that the scientists that like things like propagules and communities and ecosystems also saw that their definition is one and the same, the scientific version of the policy definition. And that's really important actually, because otherwise the scientific community can go one way and the political community can go another direction. Another challenge that we faced is a lot of people say, well, we already have a tool, it's called protected areas, or this other thing called other effective conservation measures, which I won't describe, but is similar to protected areas. It's about biodiversity protection. And they certainly can conserve biodiversity, as you can see by this graph, but they don't necessarily have to. So if you're in Yellowstone National Park, what you'll notice is that a lot of animals like elk and pronghorn and others leave the park in the winter because the snow is too deep, right? And so they're not fully protected. Whereas corridors, ecological corridors, what they have to conserve is ecological connectivity, but it might not be for the rest of biodiversity. It might be across lands where there's human activities as long as they're compatible with maintaining connectivity. Whoops. And so it's also important to describe within the context of this what an ecological network for conservation is. It's these protected areas, other conservation areas. So you can see in this example here in Thailand, you have green protected areas, you have wildlife sanctuaries in that tan color, and this pink is actually the non-hunting areas, or and you can see in the red areas, they've identified where their ecological corridors are. So another way to look at this is you have sort of your, we have to connect among the realms, the terrestrial and the ocean realms. So we've got protected areas, we've got these corridors by these dotted lines, and some corridors, as it turns out, could be stepping stone corridors. Like for these birds, you'll see that they don't necessarily need them to be continuous, right? So in fact, it turns out that for connectivity, you can have stepping stone or you can have continuous. The most important thing here in this, in the work that we've done at the global level is really being clear on what is conservation of an ecological corridor. So what do you want to conserve? Is it elephants? Is it an entire ecosystem? Is it a suite of species? So defining that. Making it sure that you're connecting protected area to protected area. I'm not going to go through all of these, but it also has to be delineated. In science, people say, oh yeah, some wildlife can get across this matrix of humanity. But the reality is that matrix is constantly changing because we're developing it, right? And so we have to find specific geographic places on the ground that we can permanently protect specifically for connectivity. And then we have to be able to ensure the long-term management of it, just like we do for protected areas. So fundamentally, ecological corridors, they're not a substitute for protected areas or other conserved areas, right? Those are really important. In fact, corridors are only relevant if you can connect those protected areas. And what they really are is a building block of ecological networks, right? So if you have this isolated protected area because increasing humanity is around it, you can ensure that it gets connected to other protected areas. And in addition to that, they have to have specific and clear ecological objectives, and they have to actually be governed and managed. What can happen in that corridor? It might be that certain times of the year you have lay down fences so that wildlife can get easily across, and that's in the management guidelines. It might mean that at certain times of the year, people aren't allowed in that place, but those activities that are allowable and unallowable need to be clearly laid out. And that it's managed for connectivity, which is very different than all of biodiversity or a national park. we think that, and what this document promotes is that to get to ecological standards and to really conserve biodiversity over the long term, these need to be enduring, right? So we've heard from Alex, and we've heard from the senator that, you know, corridor legislation at the state scale, even in municipalities, at the national scale, and even in transboundary pacts is really important. But given that we don't have them in a lot of places, this is an example of a number of the different tools that can exist in the interim, because we really can't afford to wait. We need to move forward with legislation as well as action on the ground at the same time. I want to point out that just like protected areas, if you go to a protected area in the marine environment or one in the terrestrial environment, we know it's a protected area. How do we know? Because IUCN agreed upon a definition that all countries adhere to. Likewise, we need to get to that with ecological corridors. What is an ecological corridor, and be really clear about that, and that it works in the marine environment, the freshwater environment, the terrestrial environment, and maybe even someday in the airspaces. You know, the reality is that, and we've heard a little bit about this, that there are actually already agreements and conventions in place that need this, and we already are seeing some legislation move forward. Right now, as an example, here are 4 different kinds of laws and policies that incorporate or refer to connectivity or need it to be successful. We can look around the world. It turns out, I love this map of Bhutan. Because of their gross national happiness index, they already put 50% of their land into protected areas, and you can see these green corridors that they've already designated. And many, many other countries around the world are in fact far ahead of us. We can do this in the United States, and it's really exciting to see Udall and Biden coming in with 30 by 30 commitments and really looking at conservation in a much more holistic way. With regards to ecological corridors, we're promoting that the Protected Area Planet World Database on Protected Areas begins to hold just as they do. If you want to know any protected area in the world, you can go to this database and find it. And every country in the world submits their protected areas to this as part of the Convention on Biological Diversity. We're promoting the same for corridors. If you're interested in examples of how ecological corridors are moving forward, we have 25 different examples, including the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, but also a lot of marine, terrestrial, and freshwater examples from around the world. You know, if you want to find that information in more detail, there's the website there, and I'm always happy to be available to chat, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Hilty. That was so great to hear about the, you know, the global perspective on all that, and a lot of the ins and outs of what makes an effective corridor. So thanks so much. So now we have Beth Pratt. She is the California Regional Executive Director for the National Wildlife Federation. She leads the Save LA Cougars campaign to build the largest wildlife crossing in the world in the Los Angeles area to help save a population of mountain lions from extinction. And she's also the author of the book, When Mountain Lions Are Neighbors. So I'm pleased to introduce Beth Pratt.
Well, thanks, Alex, and thanks Environment America for all the work you're doing for hosting us, and also to Dr. Hilty and Senator Stewart for the incredible work you're doing. You know, corridors and connectivity to me is one of the most important things we can tackle these days to help with that 30-30. Because, you know, we know the #1 threat to wildlife worldwide is loss of habitat, and this is something that needs to be addressed. So I'm going to talk about a specific project building on the great presentations already done. So let me see if I can share my screen without screwing it up, if everybody can see that. I think I shared the wrong one. Hold on a second. Sorry. Always technical difficulties. Let's try this again. Okay, did it now. But thank you. So I work for the National Wildlife Federation. I have probably the best job in the world, I think, which is advocating for the state of California's remarkable wildlife. But most of my time these days is working on the Save the Cougars campaign, which is not hard either. I think it's one of the best projects and, you know, ecologically significant as well. But let's start off with what's really important, which is mountain lion kittens. My dogs will probably react to the sound, but this is really what we're trying to achieve with the wildlife crossing at Liberty Canyon, is ensure that kittens like these have a future. And these are some of the newest kittens in the study, and they may be some of the first mountain lions to use the crossing once it's done. So that's really exciting to me. We just released some really incredible new visualizations this year done by Living Habitats LLC to show what this crossing will look like, which I think it was really great. Dr. Hilty outlined corridors and connectivity is not all about crossings, and it's not just about getting the big animals across the road. And as I'm going to go into, we're actually with this wildlife crossing trying to reconnect an ecosystem for all wildlife. As you can see here, it really is reconnecting, sort of putting the nose of the mountain back, like is a term I've used. And you can see here just how it really does try to make the best of putting an ecosystem back over one of the busiest freeways in the country. And as I said, it's not just about mountain lions, at least for this crossing. You know, other crossings may just be about the big guys, but for us, it's about creating a living ecosystem. For me, what's also exciting about this project is a great example of a public-private partnership. We have 5 main partners that work on this day to day, and of course, a whole host of others. But the National Park Service, whose research has shown that the mountain lions will go extinct if we don't do something. Caltrans, it's their road. They've been an amazing partner. They're like, get us the funding, we'll do it. The Resource Conservation District of the Santa Monica Mountains, who brings in so much knowledge about the local landscape and how to bring that to the crossing. The Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, who preserved the land on either side and had the foresight to do that even decades ago. As you pointed out, Dr. Hilty, protected space on both sides is the biggest indicator of success. And then my group, the National Wildlife Federation, and we've taken responsibility for the education, outreach, advocacy, and of course, the fundraising. And our campaign looks at all of that, you know, both building the crossing, but also sort of creating this movement to support crossings going forward. And this, you know, obviously the science around this too. Where we're at, despite all the incredible challenges this year, people really continued to step up, and we raised over $3 million this year. We've raised $18 million total for the campaign. We still have a bit to go, but we're nearing the finish line, and it's not just $10 at a time anymore. But I think for me, what this shows is even one of the, you know, during arguably the most challenging time in my lifetime, people still want projects like these to happen. So it's really stepped up. We are in phase, and these phases are dictated by Caltrans, who is obviously, these projects are not unique to a crossing. We're in phase 3 of 4. And when I first started this on this project, it was kind of an idea, and you know, it was kind of like, we need to do this thing and we don't know what the thing is, you know, we just know we need to do something, and we had no money. And that was, we're now at 18 million and pretty close to blueprints, which will be released this spring. So wow, it's amazing the progress we've made. And again, that's the outpouring of support from the public, really. I did want to touch on how we're doing this, because I get asked to talk about that is just as much as what we're doing. And we owe it all to P22. I mean, I think we're all familiar with this famous Steve Winter photo at this point, but it's his story that has made connectivity and crossings relatable. You know, I think Dr. Hilty, how you talked about you had to get the scientists involved. Listen, I'm a scientist, and you know, and the science is important, but if we don't translate it for the public, these things are not going to get built, right? And that's really for us the long game with this campaign, is obviously we are guided by the science and what we do and how we do it, but how we're getting it built is the public and getting the public engaged. And, you know, we have people who are advocating from P22. We do, you know, school programs. They're writing him Valentines. We have a festival every year that in Griffith Park that gets 8,000 people coming out to celebrate a mountain lion. Here's some scenes from it. We have hip hop music. Students are building crossings as part of their schoolwork and exhibiting it. We have a clothing line for P22. Your holiday sweater or your P22 shirt. We just came out with that as an actual P22 face on those masks. We have a P22 plushie, one of our most popular projects. Yeah, even has its own tracking collar. Trading cards for the Cougars of LA. We also have a VR film that is really popular where you can actually see the crossing and what it's going to look like from a mountain lion's point of view. We have hip hop artists who have written songs about P22. And we actually, it's Hollywood, you know, P22 is a Hollywood cat. We do a lot of celebrity engagement, which gets the public involved as well. So Brad Pitt, we call P22 the Brad Pitt of the cougar world because he's handsome, beloved, but also struggles with his dating life. And you know what this is translated to, yes, it's fun, and but we're talking about this translating into real outcomes for conservation. I think there's a big lesson here that, yeah, the science is important, but God, we've got to get the public to love the animals in these corridors we're wanting to protect. And this has resulted in some impressive stats. From 18 million raised, when we put this out for environmental document, review 8,800 comments for and only 15 against. As I said, a billion media impressions, 2,900 donors from all over the world. And, you know, these are from Kansas, from London, from all these places, and some others such as California ESA Protection Advance Forward. To me, the greatest measure of success, or one great measure of success, was Governor Newsom, who is a big supporter of this project, tweeted out, P22 will always have my heart. I don't think you can find too many other governors across the country who would tweet out, I heart a mountain lion. So, you know, this is a testament to you got to get people emotionally involved. And I'll just end with National Geographic recently. This was a big honor, especially because we all need cause for hope, said that we were the top thing to look forward to in 2021. And if we stay on track with fundraising, we do hope to break ground this fall. And we invite all of you here to join us for that. So thank you for the time today on what I think is one of the most incredible conservation projects I've ever worked on. And we look forward to seeing this happen. So let me stop sharing my screen here. There we go.
Thanks, Beth. That's so great to hear about the project that you're working on and P22 and the whole overpass over the 101. It's really inspiring. So I think now we're going to move on and take some questions from the audience.
Yep, absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and start with questions. I do want to say, Beth, I wrote down "This cougar can coexist" because I love that messaging so much. Let's start, just because it's come up a couple times and I saw that there was a question in the Q&A portion. Also, I just want to remind everyone, if you're on the webinar, use the Q&A portion or the chat portion if you have questions. And if you're on Facebook Live, just put it in the comment section. Can someone please explain the 30 by 30 initiative?
Sure. Yeah, there's a big movement around the world. So there is the geeky science that underlays it, which suggests that really what wildlife and ecosystems ultimately need, if we're going to stop the decline of biodiversity, is actually somewhere probably around 50% of the planet needs to be left for nature. The movement, so right now about 12% of the United States is in protected areas per se. And so what Udall and Biden and others have sort of started to promote is that we need to commit as a country that we get to 30% of our lands and our waters protected by 2030 to really move our country significantly in the right direction.
Thank you for that clarification. And I know I just recently learned about 30 by 30 and have been really excited about it. I'm going to ask one of the questions that's in the chat, but first I have to just get this in. Beth, if we all want to go get the mask or the holiday sweater, is there a link that we can get in the chat so that all of us can wear our P22 masks?
Yes, and all of it goes to Build the Crossing. I'll put the link in. It's www.savelcougars.org. And then there's a shop button on the top you can press. And we'll keep you well supplied in cougar swag for a good cause.
Perfect. That was my personal question. I do want to ask one of the questions, but excuse me while I leave here to go order my mask. So we have a question in the chat about relating the importance of corridors to the importance of people, you know, leaving their home to start families and reproduce. So will these wildlife corridors, do they help wildlife basically have healthier offspring? And is that part of it? Is that they need this ability to move and meet new cougars?
If I could take the first stab at that, just because again, every crossing has different aims. Ours is very different than, like, you look at like the Utah one that went viral, right? They were really trying to stop a slaughter alley segment. Ours is more, actually, we don't have that many cougars getting hit right there because the freeway is 10 lanes. I wouldn't even try to cross it at 2 a.m. It's still trafficked. But what we're having is, because they are turning around, the genetic decline is such that these guys are going to go extinct, because much like the Florida panther, because they're not going to be genetically sustainable anymore. So much so, the National Park Service research was sort of raising the alarm bell that we don't want it to get as bad as the Florida panthers. What happened this summer, we're starting to see physical birth defects. And that means game over much quicker. The only thing I will add is, it's not just unique to the cougars. The Park Service's same research is showing that this genetic decline also is occurring in lizards and birds. So, back to Dr. Hilty's, study on what are the problems if we don't have connectivity. We tend to think it's the roadkill. It's actually more about that, yes, for some migratory paths, that's it, but it's actually more about creating genetically resilient and viable populations.
Yep. And I would add to that, at some point, if you have 15 of any animal, let's say it's a mountain lion, at some point, you're not going to have a breeding age female. And if you can't reconnect that population, there won't be any more reproduction. So they'll disappear. So connectivity can really help there.
Alex, do you want to ask one of your more technical, in-depth questions?
It's not that technical, but I have a question. So here's my question for you. Is there a downside to building corridors, and why would anybody be against this?
I can take a first stab unless somebody else does. Yeah, I think there's sort of two concerns about corridors. One is the concern about, if we have a limited pool of conservation resources, maybe it should just go to protected areas, which is sort of a falsehood, right? If the protected areas don't work by themselves, then you need both. And the second is, and I think Senator Stewart got to this, that some people are really worried because often our public lands are surrounded by private lands. And so these corridors require working across different landowners. And a lot of landowners have an initial fear about this idea of having something designated across their land. And it really takes a lot of conversation and finding that common ground. Ranchers, for example, really often have a strong appreciation of nature and natural resources, and will talk about the animals that they see while they're out on the range. And it's about finding that common agreement of what their vision is for their land, which often really matches well with maintaining connectivity.
And I would say the only other downside is that it's expensive to change the way you put in a highway. It's expensive, as Beth showed. I love that LA cougar. Yeah, I've been looking at that for a long time, but that's an expensive project. And you need everybody who's going to be impacted by it involved. So it was when we really put a community input, community support, community outreach for the game and fish and transportation that we calmed down some of the worries that people had. And ranchers or farmers sometimes think that they're going to be heavily impacted, and they don't have to be. They really don't. So I agree with Jody that, when you get right down to it, we all want to protect our environment. We do. So some people have different reasons for it, but we all want it protected. And it's important that we teach our children the importance of protecting wildlife and doing it in such a way that we really do protect them. So I don't think there's any downside.
I'll just agree with Senator Stewart. I don't think there's many downsides. And I will say, you know, this project has very little opposition, but it breaks down. And Senator Stewart, thanks for calling out. I can't, you know, this will probably be one of the most expensive, if not the expensive, although I don't see it as that expensive given what I know about transportation costs. And, but this is one of the most difficult engineering, you know, crossings you will find, because we don't, you know, there's one place we can put it. So that was why we thought the private, you know, philanthropy needs to step up, because that is the opposition cost. People are like, your taxpayer dollars are going to, you know, but that's why I do look forward to the day. And you had mentioned it, Senator Stu, and the work you're doing is when these are just in transportation budgets, right? I would love to be out of a job having to fundraise for them. So I think, you know, the cost does put, you know, some people off that, but the second one is, listen, especially with mountain lions, fear. You know, California seems to be very mountain lion friendly, but you know, that's not shared everywhere. So I think there is, especially when you're talking about living with predators, fear, and that is why I think it's, as we all do on this talk, we also take the responsibility very seriously, like with, you know, using P22 to educate about how to coexist. And you know, he's not a pet, and you know, there's never zero risk with wildlife, but I think you know, doing the education that it's pretty low risk. And indeed, you're more likely to die on that freeway, you know, that we're trying to cross for wildlife than by any, you know, predator, I think is something that we really try to help people understand.
And I got to pile on that it turns out there is pretty good research out there in areas where there are significant amounts of roadkill, that it's actually cheaper for society when you look at the cost of insurance and health issues from hitting a moose and having it land in your lap and all of that. It's actually cheaper for us and safer if we put in these wildlife crossing structures. And there is a more expensive crossing structure going in India, and it's a huge open span overpass for elephants to get under. But I have to say that Beth is probably the most creative person I've seen, and the amount of publicity that you've done and the creativity, it's just fun to get to see what you're doing and work with you on occasion, because it's really helping change public sentiment. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for letting me know we're not the most expensive. I can't wait to use that. That's great news.
Yeah, when I was preparing for this over the week, I was looking and I saw the elephant corridor in India, and I was like, this just makes me so happy.
Listen, I'm going to go back to Caltrans too. At least you don't have to engineer for elephants, okay? So,
I know that we are kind of running up on time, and I know that Senator Stewart's time is very tight. So I did want to ask one question that was asked in the chat that just went to the panelists, and Senator Stewart did a great job of answering questions throughout, but I think that only we are able to see it, and I loved her answer. So I'm going to ask this publicly, if that's okay with you, Senator Stewart, and you give your wonderful answer. KDM asked, how do Native tribes feel about corridors that go through their lands here in the U.S.?
So New Mexico has 19 pueblos and 3 reservations, including the Navajo Nation, the Jicarilla Apache, the Mescalero Apaches. They already do wildlife corridors. They're totally into it. They came to every meeting and supporting it. They had their lobbyists stand up, and then we used some of their video. Kavu, it's Kavu. It's an environmental group that's doing movies, videos to support wildlife corridors, wildlife trafficking, another bill I did, other kind of environmental things. They went into the tribes and they talked to the elders. And the elders talked about how they'd always had through their lands a corridor designated for cougar or bear. They keep them sacred. They're much better stewards of the land and animals than us white folk. I'm embarrassed about that. I mean, that they put us to shame. They're already doing it. They're totally into it. They were a complete supporter of the bill, and we're working with them now, Department of Transportation, Game and Fish. It's just very exciting to feel like we're all working now in New Mexico on saving our wildlife.
And can I point out some of the first crossings that went in the United States on 93 were on the Flathead Reservation, right? So yeah, I mean, And we work closely with the Chumash, which is our native tribe there, to ensure that that's going to respect not just building it and looking at archaeology, but the interpretation and education around it. And so yeah, it's true. They did a much better job. We're just sort of catching up.
We would just stop building buildings everywhere. Well, thank you. I've so enjoyed this, and it was so exciting to see the LA Cougar demonstration online.
Thank you so much.
To come out once it's safe.
Absolutely, and I'm going to get one of those masks.
Thank you, Senator. I also, just before you left, wanted to tell you my mom is watching this and texted me and said, oh my gosh, I read about Senator Stewart's program years ago and have been saying we need this here in Virginia because our interstate is so just insane. And so I just wanted to tell you, she was like, oh my gosh, it's her. I read about this.
I will put my email in the chat. And if people want more information, I will try to send it to them.
Great.
Thank you so much, Senator Stewart. If we could possibly keep Beth and Dr. Hilty around for just a couple more questions.
Sure.
Thank you again, Senator Stewart, so much for joining us and all the work that you're doing. We really, really appreciate it.
And I appreciate all you guys. We couldn't do our work with the solid advocacy work. Michael Dax, Defenders of Wildlife, did as much work on this as I did. So I'm very grateful for our environmental groups. Okay, see you on the other side of the corridor.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and let Alex ask a question that we came through on Facebook.
Oh,
is that okay?
I have that one ready. I have a different one.
Okay, go ahead, Alex.
Is this the in California question?
Yes, that's the one.
I got it. And so in California, organizations such as the Local Agency Formation Commission oversee land use decisions. How will science and these initiatives be communicated to such groups which are not composed of scientists or environmentally aware appointees?
So is that for me? Well, yeah. I mean, Dr. Hilty may have some examples, not just specific to California, but I will say my experience is, I mean, you saw, Governor Newsom's response, and, we just did a presentation to the new district director at Caltrans, and I actually think the same applies. I mean, the science is communicated to them, right? But I think my approach has been to also communicate the value system and the excitement around this wonder of wildlife and wanting to preserve it. So, I think that these agencies are kind of inundated by science, right? And I think one lesson we've learned here is the public engagement you saw. Again, we have, just people like, Jared Leto with a P22 plushie. That is actually helping the agencies and the legislator and the donors. They point to that, right? It's not just these environmentalists behind closed doors saying we need to do this. It's hip hop artists from Watts saying we love this. And so I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for, but you have to keep up the traditional, sending the science, filing the reports, doing the research. I mean, we couldn't do it without that. But I think the lesson, at least for me, who was doing it the traditional way for most of my career, is the agency folks have emotional ties to things just like we do. Dr. Hilty, did you want to add to that? I'm not sure that was probably a satisfying answer for the person, but.
Hey, Beth, you can call me Jody.
Okay, thank you.
So can you all. Yeah, I think really it's about, in working with agencies and politicians, they want the information. So it might be science, it might be biological information. What do the wildlife need? It might be human dimensions. What do the communities around the affected area think about it? It might be economic. Is this really a good investment? And then they also want to hear from their constituents. And I think there's nobody better at doing that than Beth. I mean, it's just phenomenal how good she is at communicating sometimes really complicated ideas. If you ever are struggling with a complicated idea and how to communicate it easily, just give Beth a call.
Oh, thank you. Not math ones, though. No math ones, please.
This has just been amazing. And I just really appreciate all of your answers and everything you've shared. And I think, some of the things that you've said is this, especially around the issue of cost, right? It's like, what is the cost of not acting? What is the true cost? And I think that question comes up so much in climate and conservation issues is, all right, you want to talk about cost, let's talk about it, but let's actually get the true cost. So I really appreciate you all.
And let's put it in perspective. Nobody would blink an eye at spending $85 million to build, a new football stadium, right? I mean, I think we really have, I actually push back a lot at $85 million again. That's nothing. That's nothing to save an ecosystem. So I agree. Like the cost is something, and I love, Jody, but Dr. Hill, I mean, the cost of not acting is higher too, right?
And the football team name would probably be the Cougars.
Oh yeah, definitely.
The question that we always end with here on Conservation Conversations is, the audience that this series draws tends to be folks who hear the term wildlife corridors and think, wow, I'd really like to learn about that. So they're generally somewhat engaged. So Dr. Hilty and Beth, what do you want people to leave here today and do? What is maybe one action that we can all walk away from here and do to help, be a part of the positive change that you all are working towards?
Well, I think it's really easy. I mean, it would be great if every single person decided whether it's local in their town, regional, like California, or national, they choose one politician that represents them and they say, I want to have a conversation with you about why we need to establish permanently protected ecological corridors in our backyards.
I will second that. It really, especially on the scale we're talking about, it requires government, whole scale funding. I mean, Liberty's just one thing in California. We need to do more. So but I'll add to that, like something real easy people can do. I think, thinking about, again, corridors and connectivity, we have these big things like Liberty Canyon or others, but plant some milkweed in your backyard, put up a bird bath, right? These are simple things, think of corridors and connectivity, not just in terms of these big projects. I mean, monarch butterflies are almost on their way out in California. You can help with connectivity, which is what they need, and to spaces that have food and pit stops. So I think we can all be part of the solutions, whether it be legislatively, which is absolutely critical, or just look at your own yard. You have a fence up that is stopping wildlife from being able to move. Like, think of it, look through life with an animal's eyes in your communities as well, and try to fix those small scale things.
Amazing. And also contribute to, Beth put the say of LA Cougars links. Dr. Hilty, is there anything that people can do directly for your organization? Is there ways that they can support you?
Absolutely. Even today, we Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, you could go to it at www.y2y.net. We today put out a call to action to call the BC government, and there's links to how to do that to stop the third dam. It's called the Site C Dam in northeastern British Columbia, which is just further severing the Y2Y region.
And can I just put out a call to Y2Y? I worked in Yellowstone, and that's where I became familiar with Y2Y. And corridors was not on my radar. It was sort of that first awakening to, it's not enough just to have a Yellowstone. And the work you guys are doing on such a large scale basis is phenomenal. And I think has inspired the rest of us to think about public lands in a very different way. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, well, we're going to wrap it up so we don't take up any more of your time. Thank you so much, Beth and Dr. Hilty. This was a wonderful conversation. I feel like, the five of us could sit down and talk for hours on this, honestly. But right, exactly. So we'll wrap it up. If you like all of the work that we're doing, please consider, buying a cougar mask, go to Save LA Cougars. Consider donating or doing call to actions to Yellowstone to Yukon. Senator Stewart, I'm sure, you can follow her on social media, or Wild Friends, her group of the students that are working on this as well. So also please consider supporting Environment America, Environment Missouri, and Environment Maryland. We will be having another Conservation Conversations coming up in February. We're just going to keep rolling with the second Thursday of every month. So we hope to see you all there. And again, thank you so much, Beth, Dr. Hilty, and also Alex for, facilitating this as well, and Kate. So thanks you all. For having us. Oh, all right, everybody have a good night. Thank you.